everybody. I will be talking about the brain and mental illness today. So the focus of this presentation will start out by describing brain areas and function, and from that, I'll be taking a closer look at a common mental illness called major depressive disorder and the treatments and future developments for treating major depressive disorder. So starting out with the brain, it's a very complex organ, and research of neuroscience only started taking off in the 1950s. And from that 70 years, scientists have estimated that only about 30% or 40% of brain function has been uncovered. So while we have made many leaps and bounds, there's still lots of work to be discovered. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord, and basically the brain and spinal cord help integrate external stimuli to form a response, and it does that in conjunction with the peripheral nervous system, which is all of the nerves outside of the brain and spinal cord. So in purple, you have the brain and spinal cord, which, as I said before, is the central nervous system. So starting out with brain structures, we have the cerebral cortex. And you'll see in the bottom image, it's the dark pink area. So it's the outer layer of the brain. And the bottom image is cut in half. So the top image is a more accurate depiction of the cerebral cortex. It covers the entire brain, and it's made up of 4 lobes called the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. So the frontal lobe is the blue area here. It's the frontmost part of the brain, and it's responsible for higher order cognition like decision making, mood, and emotion. And scientists say it's the most complicated part of the cerebral cortex because in addition to that, it's also responsible for movement, and the frontal lobe helps plan and execute movement. The parietal lobe is located behind the frontal lobe, this yellow area here, and it's responsible for tactile integration and processing. So because of the parietal lobe, you're able to feel what you touch and understand what you're touching. So we would be able to tell the difference between hot and cold and tell whether 2 objects are touching us as opposed to 1. And damage to the parietal lobe would result in a lack of understanding of what you're touching. So what that means is you would be able to feel what you touch, but you just wouldn't be able to understand what it is that you're touching. The temporal lobe is responsible for hearing and auditory recognition, and memory as well. So damage to this area would result in poor memory, and similarly to the parietal lobe, you would be able to hear, but you just wouldn't be able to understand what you hear. And the temporal lobe is below the parietal lobe, and it's this green area over here. So the last part of the cerebral cortex is the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is responsible for visual processing and integration. So damage to this area would result in an inability to understand what you're seeing. But in addition to that, you may also experience color blindness, partial or full blindness, and hallucinations. The next major brain structure I'll be covering is the limbic system. And as you see here, the limbic system is below the cerebral cortex. So it's this reddish area here under the green part. And the limbic system is responsible for emotion and memory, among other things. And It's a major player in bodily homeostasis, which is a state of balance in the body. And the limbic system has many tiny brain structures which are important in maintaining bodily homeostasis. There are two structures in the limbic system which I'll be focusing on, and that's the hippocampus and amygdala. And the reason I'm focusing on this is because they're very important in depression, and they play a huge role in the treatment of depression. So the hippocampus is responsible for memory and retrieval, as well as spatial learning and navigation. So damage to this area would result in an inability to form new memories and a hard time recalling previous memories. And the amygdala is responsible for emotional processing. So basically when the brain integrates external stimuli, the amygdala formulates a response based on that, and the hippocampus and amygdala work closely to form memories based on that response. The last brain structures I'll be covering are the brainstem and cerebellum. So these two brain structures are incredibly important to human life. So the brainstem is responsible for things which you aren't consciously aware of, and that would include things like breathing, heart rate, and temperature. So damage to this area would have severe complications, as you would have trouble breathing and your heart rate and temperature would be irregular. The cerebellum is responsible for balance mostly and muscle tone. So damage to the cerebellum will result in poor balance and significantly weakened muscles. So moving on to major depressive disorder, from the information I presented, I will describe the biology of depression and its treatment. So starting off with the symptoms of depression, there are lots of symptoms of depression, which I won't go into full detail about, but the majority of the symptoms are low mood, low energy, lack of pleasure in activities, weight and appetite changes, inappropriate guilt, and suicidal thoughts. And in order to be diagnosed with depression, you need to have these symptoms for at least 2 weeks. So depression is a very complex illness with multiple causes and aspects, but in this presentation, I will be specifically focusing on brain structures and neurotransmitters, HPA axis dysfunction, and hormonal imbalances. And if you don't know what that is, I'll explain it later, and epigenetics. So there are consistent abnormalities in 3 specific brain structures in patients with depression, and these brain structures are the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And specifically, the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus are underactive, but the amygdala is overactive. And stress and grief, among other things, can cause these changes. So the prefrontal cortex is highly responsible for mood, motivation, and energy and decision-making. So an underactive prefrontal cortex would result in low energy, low mood, and poor decision-making. While underactive prefrontal cortex is fairly straightforward, an underactive hippocampus is a bit more complicated, but as I said before, the hippocampus is responsible for long-term memory and retrieval. So working with the amygdala, the hippocampus relays responses to known threats. And a good example of how the hippocampus works is if normally, like if you're, for example, let's say you're making tea in a tea kettle and the whistle goes off, you would get startled the first time it went off, but the second time it went off, you most likely wouldn't get startled because the hippocampus created a memory based on that stimuli, and you know now that it's not a threat. But if the hippocampus is underactive, the learn response is less pronounced. So in the same example, if someone with the underactive hippocampus heard the tea kettle go off a second time, they would most likely get startled. So the amygdala forms connections with many brain structures in integrating external stimuli and forming responses based on that. So the major connection is the amygdala with the hippocampus. And if the amygdala is overactive, the emotional responses to negative stimuli are heightened. So that's why in depression, you'll see symptoms like excessive sadness, guilt, and emotional instability. And a hyperactive amygdala is the reason why patients with depression can sometimes have reactions to things which are otherwise normal. So I explained why it's underactive, but you're probably wondering what exactly is the reason for this dysfunction. So the growth of neurons is a major role in causing this dysfunction. In the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, the growth of neurons is reduced. And what that means is that the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex neurons don't grow as often as they normally would. So that is the reason for the underactivity. And in the amygdala, the opposite thing happens. So the growth of neurons is increased. So there would be more neurons than normal, causing the amygdala to be overactive. So moving on to the molecular level of understanding the brain, to understand depression, you have to know that neurons are the communication medium between cells in the brain. And neurons communicate with neurotransmitters. So basically how neuronal communication works, I'll explain in this example. So let's start off with the blue neuron. An electrical impulse will travel down the blue neuron, and this circle is magnified to this specific part here, but the nerve impulse would reach the end of the blue neuron, which would cause the neurotransmitter to be released. And once the neurotransmitter is released, it goes down to the pink neuron and attaches to the receptor, which then sends a signal. And neuronal communication can't happen without the receptor on the receiving neuron. So receptors are basically the receiving part of the neurotransmitter. But in order for a signal to be sent, the neurotransmitter must bind to the receptor. And that's basically how communication between neurons work. So taking a closer look at specific neurotransmitters, as you can see, there are many. And in this picture, the function of the neurotransmitters is extremely simplified because each neurotransmitter has a very complex mechanism, but there are several neurotransmitters, and each of these neurotransmitters play a role in mental health. For example, dopamine is involved in motivation and energy, and glutamate is involved in learning. But to keep things simple, I'll only be focusing on serotonin for this presentation. So serotonin, this page may look confusing, but I'll break it down for you. So serotonin's chemical name is 5-hydroxytryptamine, and that is abbreviated to 5-HT. So from that, scientists classify it by the receptor and subtype. So first, the receptor in question will be classified by a number, and the specific subtypes of the receptor, which means that the subtypes have similar functions to each other, are classified by letter. So in this example, there's 5-HT1A, 5-HT1B, etc. And not all receptors have subtypes, as you can see. Only a couple of receptors do. And I won't be going in depth into all of them. So to understand the biology of serotonin, it's important to know what the specific receptor does, which neurons the receptor is located on, and where in the brain it's located. So I'll take, for example, the 5-HT1A receptor and the 5-HT2A receptor. These have different physiological effects on neurons and have different distributions within the brain and are located somewhat differently within the brain. So taking a closer look at these two specific receptors, the 5-HT1A and 5-HT2A receptor are highly implicated in depression, and the other serotonin receptors also play a role, but I'll only be focusing on these two. So the 5-HT1A receptor, let me say that again. When serotonin binds to the 5-HT1A receptor, dopamine release is increased. So that would result in fewer symptoms of depression, because when dopamine is released, mood and energy increases. And when serotonin binds to the 5-HT2A receptor, dopamine release is inhibited. So that would mean that depressive symptoms worsen because mood and energy decreases. And the 5-HT1A receptor, scientists have done studies, and it's been noted that in patients with depression, the 5-HT1A receptor is reduced, meaning that on neurons, there are less 5-HT1A receptors. And for the 5-HT2A receptor, there are actually more than normal. So that would mean in patients with depression, there'd be more 5-HT2A receptors on neurons. So the next thing I'll be covering is the HPA axis. So I mentioned it before, and it's a very important thing to cover in depression, because people do tend to think that depression purely has to do with the brain. And while the brain is a big part of depression, there are also some hormonal imbalances that occur as well. So the HPA axis is an example of this. And to understand how it works, we need to understand what it's made of. So HPA axis basically means hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And the three organs involved are the hypothalamus, and that's located at the base of the brain, and it plays a big role in bodily homeostasis. And the next organ is the pituitary gland. It's the most significant regulator of hormone function, and it's often called the master endocrine gland because it affects almost every hormone system throughout the body. And the last part of the HPA axis is the adrenal glands, and they're located on top of each kidney, which secretes cortisol. And cortisol is the stress hormone, which obviously is released in response to stress. So the way the HPA axis works is, first, the amygdala sends signals to the hypothalamus, which then secretes corticotropin releasing factor, and that signals the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that then goes to the adrenal glands, which then releases cortisol. So that may be complicated, but the important thing to know is, since the amygdala is overactive, the HPA axis is magnified, and there'd be more cortisol released in response to stressful situations. So cortisol can be a good thing sometimes, because in a stressful situation, it can help us better manage the stressor at hand. So I'm sure all of you have experienced stress at one point or another, but prolonged exposure to stress can have a bad effect on the human body and brain. So with cortisol, if it's elevated too much, it causes the functional brain changes we've seen in depression, and that is basically the neuronal atrophy of the hippocampus, increased neuronal growth of the amygdala, and it downregulates the 5-HT1A receptor. And as I said before, the 5-HT1A receptor is responsible for reducing symptoms of depression. So by downregulating it, you worsen the symptoms of depression. So the next aspect of depression is epigenetics. So to start, epigenetics is the study of factors which changes the expression of genes, while genetics specifically looks at genes and what they do. Epigenetics studies how your external environment can increase or decrease the expression of genes, meaning it can make it more or less active or change them. So a good example of epigenetics is if you have two siblings and both of them have the same obesity gene, but sibling number one eats very healthy and exercises, but sibling number two doesn't eat healthy and doesn't exercise. Sibling number two would end up becoming unhealthy even though they have the same gene because of their environmental changes. So some specific epigenetics that we need to look at are these things called neurotrophins. So it sounds like a hefty word, but basically what neurotrophins are is much like fertilizer helps plants grow. Neurotrophins help neurons grow, differentiate, and survive. And examples of neurotrophins associated with depression are brain-derived neurotropic factor, glial cell line-derived neurotropic factor, and nerve growth factor. And these neurotrophins help neurons grow and mature, as I said before. And the expression of these are reduced in depression. So in this image, let's take a look at brain-derived neurotropic factor specifically. In stress, the neuronal expression of brain-derived neurotropic factor decreases, which causes neurons in the hippocampus to decrease, which reduces hippocampal function and eventually causes mood to decrease. Antidepressants reverse this change, which then improve mood by improving the expression of brain-derived neurotropic factor and restoring the growth of neurons in the hippocampus. The last factor in depression that I'll be looking at are things like vitamin and mineral deficiencies and hormonal dysfunction. So taking a look at this image here, there's obviously a lot of things required for the synthesis of neurotransmitters. So you'll see serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and all of these nutrients like all the B vitamins, calcium, zinc, magnesium, vitamin C, copper, they're all required for the proper synthesis of neurotransmitters. So if patients are vitamin deficient, it can result in symptoms of depression. And that's why sometimes doctors would do blood work to examine if the patient is consuming enough nutrients. And if not, they would prescribe them a nutritional supplement. An example of hormone dysfunction is hypothyroidism. And basically that's when your thyroid doesn't produce enough thyroid hormone. And if your thyroid doesn't produce enough thyroid hormone, that would result in reduced energy. So if patients with depression have hypothyroidism, that could be causing their issues, and they would be prescribed thyroid hormones as such. Now I'll be moving on to the treatments and future developments of depression. So there are many treatments for depression, including counseling, lifestyle changes, and medication, but I'll mainly be focusing on medication and brain stimulation methods. The first type of treatment I'll be focusing on are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So these are a type of antidepressants, and the way they work is they block the reuptake of serotonin into the neuron. And because of that, serotonin is able to bind to the receptors more often, and that results in fewer symptoms of depression because it gets destroyed. Serotonin gets destroyed less frequently. And to be specific, it's the 5-HT1A receptor, which is responsible for the positive side effects or the positive effects of SSRIs, and activation of other serotonin receptors, such as the 5-HT2A receptor, which I said before, can cause side effects like anxiety and fatigue. But the 5-HT2A receptor, along with other serotonin receptors, downregulate, which means the receptors become less responsive to serotonin, but the 5-HT1A receptor remains the same. And an example of SSRIs are drugs like Prozac and Zoloft, and among others. The next antidepressant class I'll be focusing on are serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And in this image, it says noradrenaline, but norepinephrine and noradrenaline are the same thing, just to clarify. And norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter which improves focus and attention. So SNRIs work much the same way as SSRIs, but in addition to serotonin, they also block the reuptake of norepinephrine. So these can be used in patients who suffer from low energy, fatigue, and lack of focus due to the effects of blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine. And some examples of these are Effexor and Cymbalta. Atypical antidepressants are drugs which can't be classified into a specific class of antidepressants because they have different mechanisms of actions. So, for example, take bupropion. That blocks the reuptake of dopamine and norepinephrine, and it's called an atypical antidepressant because it's not common. It's the only drug in its class available because it doesn't block the reuptake of serotonin. Instead, it blocks the reuptake of dopamine and norepinephrine. The next class of antidepressants are tricyclic antidepressants, and these are called tricyclic because in this image, you'll see that it has 3 rings, and that's why it's called tricyclic. And these drugs act as SNRIs. So, as I said before, it blocks the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine. And in addition to that, these drugs also block receptors for serotonin, norepinephrine, acetylcholine, and histamine. And you may not know what some of those are, but by blocking those receptors, it causes additional side effects such as weight gain, dry mouth, sedation, and low blood pressure while standing up because of blocking these receptors. And in this image, we have amitriptyline, which is a common tricyclic antidepressant, and it blocks 5-HT2A receptors, which can reduce symptoms of depression. And because of this, it's reported to be more effective than other antidepressants. The last class of antidepressants I'll be covering are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And basically, these drugs work by inhibiting an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. So by inhibiting that enzyme, it leads to increased levels of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine because the enzyme inhibits, degrades these neurotransmitters. So by doing so, there are increased concentrations of these in the brain, and that leads to antidepressant effects. So you probably haven't heard of these drugs ever, and that's because they were the first drugs to ever be developed. And the majority of these drugs have been discontinued due to side effects like liver damage and their dietary restrictions. But there are 4 on the market right now, and they're used in patients who haven't responded to other medications because they are by far the most effective class of antidepressants of oral medication for depression on the market. The next treatment I'll be focusing on is our atypical antipsychotics, and these drugs work by attaching to certain serotonin and dopamine receptors, and they can either block or stimulate them to relieve symptoms of depression. And an example of this is aripiprazole. So this drug, in this image, you'll see it stimulates dopamine and serotonin 5-HT1A receptors, but it blocks 5-HT2A receptors, which improve symptoms of depression. And there are other antipsychotics which are used to treat depression as well. So mood stabilizers are typically used to treat bipolar disorder, and the majority of them aren't used in depression, but there are 2 which are used in depression. So, for example, lithium, you may have heard of it. It treats manic episodes in bipolar disorder, and manic episodes are periods of greatly increased energy and impulsivity, which doctors consider to be the opposite of depression. And lithium prevents these episodes, but lithium can also treat depression as well by increasing the growth of new neurons and preventing neurotoxicity. And in this image, we have lamotrigine. And lamotrigine is an anticonvulsant. It's used to treat seizures, but it offers an advantage in patients with depression because it has a greater effect in reducing depression than mania. There are other oral medications which may be used to treat depression. And while these may not be approved, they still have some efficacy in treating depression in patients who haven't responded. So examples are thyroid hormones, dopamine agonists, which stimulate dopamine receptors, and stimulants. The next type of treatment is neurostimulation, and these are brain stimulation methods which are used in cases where other therapies haven't worked or an intervention is needed immediately. So the first type of neurostimulation is electroconvulsive therapy, and this was the first type of neurostimulation to ever come out. It was developed in the 1930s to treat patients with depression, and you may have heard of some of the gruesome stories, but in this day and age, it is much safer than it used to be. And the way it works is electricity is delivered to the brain, which forms a seizure, which will then change brain chemistry to improve symptoms of depression. And it does this because it causes millions of neurons to fire and form new connections. And ECT is the most effective treatment for depression to date, and it has a success rate of about 80%. The next form of neurostimulation is transcranial magnetic stimulation, and this is typically used when other medications haven't worked. So the way it works is a magnetic coil is placed on your left prefrontal cortex, and it stimulates neurons in that area, which can improve mood. And it takes about 6 weeks to work. And unfortunately, it's not as effective as ECT. Deep brain stimulation is a very rare form of neurostimulation. And the way it works is a device is surgically implanted into your brain, and an electrode stimulates areas of your brain, specifically in the limbic system, which are underactive in depression. And this as well has a moderate success rate. And to clarify, while ECT and TMS are temporary and you only get them for a certain period during your day, deep brain stimulation is permanent because it's surgically implanted. So the next treatment I'll be focusing on is vagus nerve stimulation. And you're probably wondering what the vagus nerve has to do with anything, but the vagus nerve is a very complicated cranial nerve, which scientists are still studying how it works. It originates from the brain and connects to other body parts, and it's mostly used in patients who haven't responded to other treatments and have severe symptoms. And in order to be approved for it, you have to try ECT first and be treatment resistant for over 2 years. And what happens is, like deep brain stimulation, a device is surgically implanted and it attaches to the nerve and stimulates it. And by stimulating this nerve, it reduces the body's response to stress. And in doing so, it produces the functional brain changes, like, for example, in the hippocampus, amygdala, to relieve symptoms of depression. Unfortunately, vagus nerve stimulation takes a very long time to work. It takes about 9 months to work, whereas other treatments only take about 6 weeks to get the full effects. And it has a very low response rate of about 33%. And in addition to this, vagus nerve stimulation has like many risk factors, like the surgery, for example, or having an implanted device in your body. So for this reason, it's not used that much. So there are many future developments for depression, and I will be focusing on 3. So the first one is ketamine. So you guys may have seen some ketamine clinics open up around the country, and you may even live nearby one. And these clinics are claiming that ketamine can treat depression, which hasn't responded to other meds. And the reason that ketamine is now used off-label for depression is because it was first used as an anesthetic as a safer alternative to others, because it doesn't slow down breathing or your heart rate. But upon closer study, scientists found out that it actually relieves symptoms of depression. So when scientists took a look at how it worked, they found that ketamine causes a burst of the neurotransmitter glutamate. And in this picture, it's very complicated, but it describes what happens. So it causes a burst of the neurotransmitter glutamate. And the important thing you need to remember is that because of this, it stimulates the growth of new neurons, which are underdeveloped in depression. The next medication is tolrampitor. So that's a mouthful, but it affects glutamate in a similar manner to ketamine. And The last medication I'll be focusing on for future developments is Nuplazid. And Nuplazid is a medication for Parkinson's disease psychosis. So basically, that means it's used to treat hallucinations and delusions in patients with Parkinson's disease. And it's also being studied for depression because it acts as an inverse agonist at 5-HT2A and 5-HT2C receptors. And what that means is that when it attaches to the receptor, it'll bind to it and elicit a response opposite of the receptor's original response. And these two receptors specifically increase symptoms of depression when serotonin binds to them. So when Nuplazid, like in a sense, deactivates these receptors, it improves symptoms of depression. So currently, SSRIs are the first line treatment of depression. And when a patient comes in to a doctor's office and complains about symptoms of depression, the doctor right off the bat would most likely give the patient some form of medication, but there are many things that physicians should check for before doing so, because antidepressants don't fix the root cause. And if doctors take a closer look at what could be going wrong, they could find better diagnostic tools to treat it. And some examples of these are celiac, rheumatoid arthritis, and thyroid disorders, among other things. So looking to the future, we know that there are many treatments for depression, but unfortunately, in patients that haven't responded, there is much work that needs to be done. And a good example of a new development is ketamine. Ketamine has been picking up quite a bit in patients who haven't responded, and patients do revel its benefits because many patients who have tried ketamine have tried almost everything, and ketamine was the only thing that gave them some relief from their symptoms. But an example of a shortcoming is the HPA axis. So the HPA axis decreases in response to antidepressant treatment, but there's currently no specific treatment for HPA axis dysfunction specifically in depression. But some drugs, like glucocorticoid receptor antagonists, are being researched for it. And what those drugs do are they block the effects of cortisol, but they aren't approved yet. And as I said before, I hope that in the future we'll have robust knowledge of the root causes of mental illness, and we can use more appropriate therapies as such, because antidepressants don't fix the root cause. Okay, thank you for coming and watching this presentation. I hope you liked it.